Let me just begin with the topic about psychedelic drugs and depression, and kind of where are we and where did I start out in the studies that I do in our lab. First of all, we know that high doses of psilocybin have shown great promise in relieving symptoms of depression and other psychiatric disorders, as we've heard about already. But there are many potential confounds, as we've also heard about, that relate to blinding, for example, and to expectancies and appropriate comparison conditions, and then also, importantly, the role of concomitant psychotherapy. So those are all important questions that we're all struggling with the high doses of psilocybin. So then one of the questions that arises from this the work that everyone has been doing is whether the psychedelic effects are really necessary for the antidepressant effects. And then secondly, how does psychotherapy interact with the drug effects? So these are some of the very challenging questions that are coming up in the field. And people have come up with some novel approaches to address some of these issues, and as we've already heard this morning, people are trying to develop new medications that lack the psychedelic effect. So it's a challenge for us in the field. What are we going to call these apparently psychedelic-like drugs that don't have psychedelic effects, and will they be effective? Or does the therapeutic effectiveness depend on the psychological experience? So these are all issues for us. Another possible approach is to block the memory of the psychedelic effect. So this is a question of, is it the memory of having had the experience that then has the therapeutic benefits later? And so there might be a way to test that by giving the people a full psychedelic experience and then blocking their memory of that and seeing whether they still get beneficial effects. And then the third possibility, which is the one I've kind of looked at, is administering drugs in regimens that do not produce psychedelic subjective effects and without psychotherapy. And not surprisingly, the example that I've got here that I'll talk about is microdosing. So microdosing is very popular in the general public, and the idea is that low doses, very low doses of LSD taken once every 3 or 4 days can improve cognition and mood and creativity. And a number of books have been written about this, the Microdosing Guidebook, the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. So, and there's a huge amount of enthusiasm. And here are some of just from the front pages of these books, some of the claims: a step-by-step manual to improve your physical and mental health, a practical guide to upgrade your life, and then made a mega difference in my mood, marriage, and life. So these are all big claims. They're not exactly scientifically or biologically founded. So it's going to be a challenge for us as scientists to try and unpack these and see really what is going on. So the questions that we've been asking: what is microdosing? How does it work? What's the evidence? And I'm just going to, in the next couple of slides, go over some of the reasons to be optimistic that it might have benefit, and then also some reasons for pessimism or skepticism. Some of the reasons for optimism: it's very popular. So thousands of people are microdosing, and they're swearing by the beneficial effects. There are plausible neural mechanisms. We've heard about the effects of LSD and other psychedelic drugs on serotonin circuits, and of course these are the same circuits where antidepressant drugs work as well. There are also possible anti-inflammatory and neurogenic effects that could plausibly underlie a beneficial kind of therapeutic effect. There are also, as I just mentioned, promising clinical reports with high doses of LSD, including antidepressant and anti-anxiolytic effects. And there's also some preclinical evidence. But there are also reasons for skepticism. The popular reports that we see in the media are deeply confounded by expectancy. So anybody who does microdosing on any regular basis, they all do it with very strong expectations that they're going to get some kind of beneficial effect. So nobody microdoses without expectancy. And we know, as we've already heard in presentations today, that expectancies have a very strong influence on people's responses. So this is a reason to be skeptical that maybe the microdosing, maybe the drug itself doesn't do very much. The pharmacology of these very low doses, especially given repeatedly at intervals, are poorly understood. We don't know what the optimal dose is, what the optimal interdose intervals are. We don't what the receptor adaptations when you take a drug repeatedly, whether there's tolerance or sensitization. And one of the things that concerns me is the diversity of the apparent benefits, the claims that have been made. So here is what I call the alarmingly wide range of claims that have been made about the benefits of microdosing. And just kind of pass your eyes over, this is only a small sampling of the descriptors that you can see in the literature, and this is in the published literature. So you can see, athletic coordination, reduced menopausal symptoms, enhanced sensitive, elevated mood. I mean, no drug could possibly do all these things, right? So, our job is to try and figure out what exactly does the drug do and how does it do it, basically. There are many unknowns. We don't know what exactly the drug does at these low doses. We don't know what its behavioral or mood-altering effects are, and we don't know whether these effects are from the immediate administration of the drug, the acute doses, or whether they appear only after repeated administration of the doses. We don't know how the low doses work via their mechanisms, by metabolites or changes in receptors, and also, as I mentioned, expectancies. We don't know how they should be dosed, and we don't know who benefits. So there are possibility of many individual differences that it might be more effective for younger people rather than older people, or men rather than women, or people with certain psychiatric symptoms and not with other ones, and it might also interact with prior drug use or all kinds of factors that we don't know very much about, like genetic factors as well. So we don't know the basis of individual differences, variability in how people respond. A little bit about the mechanism of action. I hardly need to tell this audience. We know it's a serotonin 2A receptor agonist, and that, as we also heard, the psychedelic effects are blocked by the 2A antagonist catanserin. But LSD also acts on many other receptors, including other serotonergic receptors, adrenergic, and dopamine receptors. And to my knowledge, we don't have a really full understanding of these very, very low doses of the mechanisms of action of the low doses, and particularly about changes that might occur over repeated administration of low doses. So we know, for example, with SSRIs, that there are all kinds of adaptations that actually contribute to the therapeutic effect that happen only over time. And so there might be something similar with that, like that here, that there might be some adaptations that then ultimately result in a beneficial therapeutic effect. So here are some of the questions that we can, so one question is about acute doses, single doses, and then we can also ask questions about changes with repeated or effects of repeated doses. One of the things I was concerned about to begin with was whether there was an accumulation of the drug. So LSD has a long half-life, and so even with 3 or 4 days between doses, there was a bit of a chance that the reason you only see something over repeated administration there might be some accumulation of the drug. There could also be tolerance, so adaptation of certain kinds to some of the effects, or there could be sensitization to other of the effects. So these would be increases on the case of sensitization, it would be only an emergence of effects with repeated doses, and tolerance, of course, would be a decline in some kind of perhaps adverse effects over repeated doses. So these are all things that we still need to discover. And then we can also ask whether novel or therapeutic effects of the drug only develop with repeated dosing. So you could look at single doses, not see very much, but then it could be, as I just said with SSRIs as well, that something might emerge if you give it repeatedly. So there's some promising evidence in the animal models, and I'm not the best person to describe these, but there is some evidence from an animal model of depression that LSD normalizes this in this animal model. It's a active avoidance learning task, and the drug then so LSD improves or reverses the deficit in active avoidance learning, and also reverses anomalies of monoamine receptor signaling in the hippocampus. There's also, as we heard, lots about the increases in neural growth And there's also very nice recent evidence from McGill University that repeated low doses of LSD in animals promote social behavior and reverse stress-induced anxiety-like behavior. So there is some promising evidence from the animal studies that these low doses might have some therapeutic benefit. So this is kind of an overview of what I know of for the low doses of LSD, or where we've derived our information. First of all, there have been many survey self-reports. So these are mostly done online. They're asking people who are already users of these drugs, do you benefit from them? And so they're asking, what are the benefits and how much do you take and how long do you take it? And so, and not surprisingly, most of these surveys, they're drawing on people who report microdosing, and so then they get quite positive responses. So we can't really learn very much about scientifically about the benefits of the drug in that way, but they're certainly very promising and very qualitatively rich, these self-report studies. There's also one study with repeated doses in older adults, and they were looking at, I think, one of their primary measures was time perception, and they saw a little bit of a change in time perception, but wasn't really looking at any kind of depressant effects or more psychological effects. There was what they call a citizen science study that got a lot of attention. And here, it was an interesting design. They recruited people who were already experienced microdosers in their natural environment. And they arranged for these microdosers to repackage their own drug in their homes in a way that could be contrasted. So they got instructed in how to put a different drug that was a placebo into one kind of capsule and their own drug, a microdosing drug, in another capsule. So they got basically their full normal dose of microdosing, or a half dose, or a placebo. And so the question then was, these people were regular users. They used their own drug. So there's always a question about what is actually in there. And then they took the drug, I think, over a 6-week period. And the upshot of it was they did see some beneficial effects of the full dose of the microdosing. But the problem was then they went back and asked the people whether they thought they got the active drug or not. And if they excluded the people who thought they got the active drug or who correctly identified it, then they didn't see a beneficial effect. So this is coming up against one of the biggest challenges in studying microdosing, that if you exclude the people who have any effect at all, you might be excluding the very people who might benefit from it. If you only use people who report experiencing no effects, then you might not be at a high enough dose in order to detect an effect. So it's a real challenge. It's a very, very difficult kind of design issue to address. Anyway, so they saw some beneficial effects, but then they basically attributed those to placebo effects because the people knew what they might be taking. So that was just a challenging, from a scientific point of view, a design point of view, it's a challenging problem. So then we've also done a number of single-dose studies in our lab that I'll tell you about, measuring either behavioral effects. So this is just looking at single doses, and then behavioral effects, and then neural effects using either EEG or fMRI. And then we've done one double-blind repeated dose study where we gave the dose repeatedly, and then one final study that I'll mention at the end as well. So in these studies, so these are the 4 studies. First, I'll call it study 1. We just basically wanted to give healthy individuals the 3 doses of LSD because we wanted to decide what dose was appropriate. This was a starting point. We didn't know what dose to give. So we gave them placebo or 6.5, 13, or 26 micrograms, and they were in randomized order. And then the next study was with just a single dose and placebo, 13 micrograms. We looked at functional connectivity in fMRI. And then the next study was with EEG, and then repeated doses we did with those. And I'm going to describe these results. So these are kind of overview of the methods that we use. And the first thing I really want to emphasize is that not only are our studies double-blind, so that neither the subjects nor the research assistants who are running the subjects know what drug they're getting. they don't know even what category of drug they're getting. So we tell them you might get a stimulant, a sedative, a psychedelic, a cannabinoid, or a placebo. We give them a whole list. So they have no idea. And we're actually running maybe 5 studies at the same time. And those studies all involve different drugs. So it's fair enough. Their friend could have been participated and they got a different drug. They were in a different study. So it's very important. So if you only tell them you're going to get either a placebo or this very powerful drug or this drug that you know a lot about, then any experiences that they experience, anything that they experience from the drug, they're going to attribute to their expectations of that drug. So if we had told them in this study you're going to get placebo or psychedelic, then you're setting yourself up for expectancies right there. So we give low doses. We recruit healthy men and women aged 18 to 35, and we carefully screen them. So we exclude people with psychiatric diagnosis or substance dependence. They have to have a minimum of high school and a good low limited body weight. And in most of these studies, or in all these studies that I'll tell you about, they also have to have used a psychedelic drug or MDMA at least once in their lives. And it's not really a safety concern. It's more a kind of public perception concern, and it was a concern of mine that I didn't want to be, as a person running the study, I didn't want to be the first person to administer the drug to these people. But there's no real reason to not do this. It was just a caution that we took. And we conduct the sessions in a comfortable living room-like environment. So in our lab, we have rooms with couches and incandescent lighting and carpets and that kind of thing. This is the timeline of the sessions. Basically, they come in and we make sure they haven't used any drugs and they're not pregnant if they're women. And they fill out some pre-drug questionnaires, and then they get their capsule, if it's a capsule, or their whatever route we give the drug. And then at regular intervals, half-hour or hourly intervals after that, they fill out more questionnaires and we get cardiovascular measures. And then at the time of expected drug effect, they either do the scan or do behavioral tasks. So that's just basically the overview of the procedure within each session. So for at least for the early LSD sessions, we didn't know how long the drug would last. I said it has a long duration of action. So for that first study, we actually kept people for 8 hours. So this is a big investment of time, and it's just a big investment of time. So the first dose determination study we did was with 20 healthy men and women. It was within subject. So each subject had all 4 conditions. They had these 4 8-hour sessions. They were 1 week apart and double-blind randomized order, and the measures were subjective ratings, so ratings about how you feel at the moment. Do you feel a drug effect? Do you like the drug effect? Behavioral measures, that is tasks, like sort of emotion tasks, and then also cardiovascular measures. And just to give you an idea of the dose range that we're in, if you look over on the right-hand side, I've copied some data from the Swiss lab where they gave 100 or 200 micrograms of LSD. And that 100 or 200, that's kind of a tripping dose. That's a full dose, basically. And this is on ratings of how much do you feel a drug effect. So the scale can go from 0 to 100. This is on the y-axis. And what's on the x-axis is time after ingestion, before and after ingestion of the drug. So you can see with a full drug effect, interestingly, at these 2 doses, you don't see very much of a dose-related effect. There seems to be some sort of a maximum there, or you just don't see a dose effect when you get up high like that. Over on the left are the data from our study. So these are ratings of feeling drug after the placebo is the lightest line at the bottom, and then 13 microgram, 6, 13, and 26. And you can see there's a dose-related and a time-related increase in people's reports of how much they're feeling a drug effect. And so we were looking again for this magical and elusive threshold dose, which is really hard to, basically what you want is something that's just below a detectable dose. Unfortunately, that's really hard to get at because people differ a lot in their sensitivity to the drug, so you might have to individualize that kind of magical subthreshold dose. In any case, we thought 13 micrograms would be sort of our best threshold dose that might be, and that's within the range that people report using in the natural situation. So one of our challenges, and this is something that came up, I think, in a couple of the previous talks already, was how do we measure psychedelic subjective effects? So we have standardized questionnaires that we use to measure every other drug, stimulants, tranquilizers, alcohol, nicotine. We have all kinds of questions. And we ask them how they feel, and do they feel stimulated? Do they feel depressed, aroused? But we realized that those standardized questionnaires were not very well suited for these psychedelic drug effects. We didn't really know what we were looking for, but we knew that our standardized questionnaires did not really fit because the psychedelic drugs have these kind of unique effects. They have sensory effects. They have perceptual effects. They have feelings of religiosity and changes in state. So these were things that we were not really equipped to measure. Then further, at high doses, they produce feelings of awe and significance and ineffability. As Dr. Geyer said, how do you do a scale to measure something that's ineffable? I mean, it's by definition not definable. So, you can't have a scale of 0 to 100 on ineffability. So these are huge challenges for us to actually measure these subjective effects. And then we didn't really know what to look for the low doses. And then this 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness, we also heard about this morning, and so that is what we use. That's our kind of gold standard for measuring psychedelic drug effects, but we didn't know whether it would be suitable for these very, very low doses that were just going to be marginally effective. Here are some of the items that are on this, and you've seen other items as well. So these are some of the items that people respond. I felt one with my surroundings. I experienced a touch of eternity. I felt connected to a higher power, experienced awe. So again, these are statements that definitely are associated with psychedelic drugs, but they're not within the normal range of psychiatric measurements, and we don't really know their sensitivity. We don't know whether a little bit of awe is more than they're just hard to quantify, basically. Just as an aside, I'm also really interested in a lot of the work that we do in our lab is trying to look at procedures and behavioral effects that have been identified in animal studies and try and apply them to human studies. And when you look at this list of drug effects with the psychedelic drugs, you think, well, how could you ever possibly study those in a rodent model? You cannot. So, in the rodents, we have the head twitch. But when you think about these are our most sensitive measures of drug effects in the humans, it's like we haven't got a chance with coming up with something that's really parallel in animals and humans. That's fine. I mean, we will just have some things may be kind of uniquely human, and we'll just have to deal with it that way. So here are the scores for those 4 doses. So we have placebo and then 3 doses of LSD in those 20 healthy volunteers, and these are their scores on one of these dimensions on that 5D. It's called oceanic boundlessness, and you can see the leftmost. There's sort of 4 little blocks of results: experience of unity, and then spiritual experience, blissful state. And the leftmost one in each of those blocks is the placebo, and then as you go right, there's a higher dose. And you can see there's a dose-related increase on each of these measures. So even at these very low doses, we're seeing a little bit of an increase on some of these scales. They don't always reach significance. There is a lot of individual variability, which makes it complicated to analyze these results. But it's kind of promising, at least, that we're in the range where people might begin to experience some of these effects. So then the next question, I've already alluded to this, is it possible that there are microdoses that are too low to produce detectable effects, and can they produce neural or behavioral effects? So the question is it reasonable to expect that if there's no change subjectively after acute doses, that you might see some kind of therapeutic or beneficial or lasting change if you give the drug repeatedly? So ideally, the way people now define microdoses are doses that are too low to produce detectable acute effects. Now, that might be too strict a criterion to put on microdoses. It might be that microdoses that produce just a little bit of an effect might have lasting effects. But anyway, this is kind of how it's been defined recently. And so then you can ask whether these subthreshold doses can change behavior if they're taken repeatedly. And then kind of relatedly, are there subtle behavioral or neural effects that predict benefits after repeated dosing? So maybe if there aren't subjective effects after a single dose, there might be some kind of measures on a behavioral task or changes in the brain that might predict that there would be some benefit. So that second study we did was to sort of look at this. We looked at effects of LSD on functional connectivity in using fMRI. The subjects had 2 5-hour sessions, 1-week intervals, and they got 0 or 13 micrograms LSD. And here we used bold resting state functional connectivity with the amygdala, and we also used arterial spin labeling. And here are the results. Basically, I'm not going to go into these. I'm not a neuroscientist, but we did find that the 13 micrograms altered resting state connectivity with the amygdala without producing significant effects. So at this very low dose, we saw a small change in brain function, even though the drug didn't produce substantial subjective effects. And the effects that we saw on connectivity here are consistent with the effects that other people have seen at higher doses. So this is promising. It suggests that there might be some kind of brain change that isn't high enough to produce subjective effects but might have beneficial effects. Then the next study we did was on EEG, where we had 2 doses. We had placebo and then 13 and 26 micrograms, and we did 128 lead EEG, and again we had resting state and then responses to stimuli. And this is the resting state. I'm not going to interpret it, but basically the drug dose-dependently decreased power in the electrodes that corresponded to the default mode network. Over on the right here is basically just the time course of the session. So there are ratings of field drug, and we did the EEG part where it's labeled. But then more interestingly, we looked at, that was just resting state. We also looked at something called the monetary incentive delay task. And this is a task that's often used to measure reactivity to a reward, either anticipation or receipt of reward. So it's kind of a measure of brain sensitivity. And it turns out that there's some patterns that people exhibit with EEG are indicative of the existence of depression. So people who are depressed show a dampened response to reward feedback on this task. So this is my collaborators at Northwestern University, Robin Nuslock and James Glazer, have done a lot of work with depression and this reward task, and they find that depressed people have a lower reactivity to receipt of reward. And so we were interested to know whether a low dose of LSD would change this neural pattern to reward. Using the incentive delay task. Basically, it's a brief laboratory task with maybe 100 or so trials where people first see a cue that tells them they're going to either earn something or not earn something, and then they have to make a response as quickly as they can, and then they get feedback that they either won something or didn't lose something, and we're recording their brain activity at each of these events. And these are the results that we found that were kind of interesting, I thought. This is a P300, so it's the curve that occurs after you get a stimulus. And the solid line at the bottom corresponds to the placebo session. So this is what their evoked potential looked like when under placebo conditions. And then you can see that with both the 13 and the 26 micrograms, they exhibited a greater response to reward when they got this reward feedback than the placebo condition. And you can speculate that increased brain response to reward might be one mechanism that could mediate kind of a beneficial therapeutic effect. So this was very promising, and we're trying to follow it up now with various other things. Again, this is just with a single dose. This is not with the repeated doses yet. So just to summarize those, we found some neural changes. We found reduced amygdala activity, decreased power in the default mode network, and then increased P300 response to reward feedback. There are lots of questions still remaining whether these neural effects, these brain effects, are related to any potential therapeutic effects and whether they change with repeated doses. Then the almost last study is this repeated microdose study that we did where we had healthy young adults who reported some negative mood. So on a questionnaire, it's called the Depression and Anxiety Stress Scale, DAS. So we tried to get people who had a negative mood to begin with. They participated in 4 sessions. Every 3 or 4 days, they had to come into the lab for this, I think it was a 6-hour session, basically. And we randomly assigned them to one of 3 groups, a placebo group, a 13 microgram group, or a 26 microgram group. And then we had outcome measures, all kinds of self-report measures, cognitive tasks, emotional tasks that they did both while they were in the lab and then also at the end. So this is a schematic of the design. So they were, first of all, screened carefully and then randomly assigned to one of those 3 conditions. So they had 4 sessions. They were separated by 3 or 4 days. So one group got placebo all the way through. The other group got 13 micrograms on 4 occasions. And then the last group got 26 micrograms. And so we wanted to know whether there was some systematic change in their responses over those 4 sessions. I should also say, just at the very end there was a post-test. So we also wanted to know whether there was kind of a lasting change even when the drug wasn't on board. So that's what that last one is. The dependent measures, lots of questionnaires about how are you feeling and how much of a drug effect. Do you feel any drug effect? Do you like the drug effect? Cognitive measures, a whole variety of those. Measures of emotional function, like a social rejection task, emotional images, so recognizing emotions in faces, for example, and then physiological measures and blood pressure. And this is a kind of an overview of the ratings on one of our measures. It's the top one is do you feel a drug effect? So it's very broad. It's not specific to what they're feeling. It's just do you feel a drug effect? And what I've portrayed there is for each of the 4 sessions. So they had 4 separate sessions, as I said, and there are these 3 groups. So the placebo group, so on the leftmost panel, top left corner is the first session, and you can see the placebo session is the open symbols, and then you have the 13 microgram and you have the 26 microgram, and you can see the 26 microgram dose is producing ratings of feeling a drug effect. So we're kind of right in the right place there, that the 13 is not different from placebo, but the 26 is showing some kind of a drug effect. And you can see the time course of it there. And quite notably, and we see this in the next slide where I'll show you with some other measures as well, the effect appears to decline with repeated administration. So this is consistent with the development of tolerance, and that's something that's been widely reported with LSD as well, that a lot of the effects do develop, the tolerance develops. I think as I tell the classes that I teach, though, that tolerance doesn't develop to all the effects of a drug. When we talk about tolerance, it's tolerance to specific aspects. So a drug produces all kinds of effects. You might see tolerance to one set of effects and not to other ones. So you might see tolerance to whether they feel a drug, but not to the cardiovascular effects. And so here, theoretically, there might also not be tolerance to some underlying behavioral effect or neural effect that could account for the beneficial effects. So just to summarize, they do feel a drug effect. It's time-dependent, dose-dependent, but appears to decline with repeated administrations across these 4 administrations. Then here are a couple of other scales. Here they're plotted a little bit differently. This is peak change within each session. So if you look at the top left there where it says vigor, and session 1. So the open bar there that goes down means that they're reporting overall, over the 4-hour or 6-hour session, they're reporting a decline in vigor. Not surprisingly, they're sitting there in a room by themselves for 6 hours or something, and they do that for these 4 sessions in a row. Anyway, decline in vigor, but then you can see that there is an increase in vigor with the 26 micrograms. So there is an effect on an acute effect of the single doses of LSD at the higher dose here, and it seems to be a stimulant-like response. So this is what we're seeing in all of our studies. We're seeing a stimulant. It's the best way to describe it is just like, it's not different. I didn't bring a slide, but it really isn't that different from what we see with amphetamine when we give amphetamine to healthy volunteers. So again, a nice dose-dependent change with the session 1, and then that dissipates by session 4, it's gone. Again, similarly with depression, these people aren't very depressed, but you can see the suggestion of an antidepressant. They feel less depressed on this profile of mood states on the first session, but then that declines across the 4. And then the last one is just a sample, a single item from that altered states of consciousness. Again, we're seeing something at the higher dose on the first session and then nothing after that. We also asked them at the end of the session, what do you think you got? So here, the first set of 4 bars there, the first set of 4 columns is placebo session, and then you have the 13 microgram, and then you have the 26 microgram, and it's for sessions 1, 2, 3, and 4. The gray at the bottom corresponds to the number of people who said they got placebo, and the red at the top is the number of people who thought they got a hallucinogen. And then the other ones, as I said, we gave them a range we told them they might get a range of different drugs, and these are some of the other options: cannabinoid, opioid, stimulant, and sedative. And you can see that basically the proportion of placebo responses goes down as you increase the dose, but it's just a subtle, it's not clear to these people, to most of the people, that they're getting a psychedelic drug. So that you see a little bit of an increase, that you see more red over on the 26 microgram dose condition than you do in the placebo condition, but it's subtle. And it's just important to remember, if we had told them you're going to get either placebo or a psychedelic drug, then basically anything that wasn't placebo would have been labeled psychedelic drug. So it's just something to be aware of when we do these studies. And we found no effect on all kinds of other measures: mood, depression, anxiety, wanting more, liking the drug. They didn't like the drug. They didn't want more of it. They didn't respond differently to positive and negative emotional images. They didn't feel less socially rejected. So basically, there was no effect of these repeated doses on many other measures. And I should say we looked at this depression and anxiety stress scale, which I said we used as a sort of an inclusion measure before we put them in. We measured them again afterwards, and it turned out that all 3 of the groups declined in their measure. Their scores declined over the course of the 4 weeks, basically it was about 3 or 4 weeks. But the placebo subjects improved just as much as the drug condition subjects. So if we had only done the drug condition, we saw an improvement, we would have said, great, there's a drug effect. We included the placebo. So just acute doses produced mild stimulant-like effects. They declined across the 4 sessions. Few effects on measures of emotion or cognition, and no lasting effects. And then finally, I just want to say this one, we're just in the middle of analyzing it, so I don't have any good statistics or very fancy figures for you. It's just in preparation. We want to know really whether the drug produces different effects in people who are higher on depression. So I said we tried to get people with negative mood, and we had a lot of difficulty finding them. Now we had a criterion of Beck Depression Inventory of a certain level, and we still didn't get so the average of the group that we got, 19 people who scored high on the Beck Depression Inventory, and then 19 who were low. And you can see from the score, the mean score was 18, which is still in the mild, very mild depression. So we're still not at high depression. So you could still critique our study for this. They had 2 sessions of placebo and 26 micrograms, and we looked at subjective ratings. And as I said, basically, we want to know whether the effects of the drug are different in people with depression or not. And these are some of the results that we've gotten so far. To start with the POMS vigor is, what level of energy do you feel right now? And as I said, that was something where we saw with all the previous studies, that's the first thing that we see is increase in energy and vigor. On the left is the people with low depression scores, and the open bars here are the scores before they got the drug, and then the slightly filled bars next to them are the scores at 120 minutes, so after drug administration. So if you look at the first pair, this is after placebo, you see not very much of a change in ratings of vigor in the low depressed people, and then also the drug didn't change vigor in these people very much either. If you look at the next set of 4 bars, you can see that placebo didn't do much in the high depression, but it did have a big effect in the So it increased ratings of vigor in the high depression people. So here's a little bit of a suggestion that the drug might have differential effects in people who have some symptomatology to begin with. So that's on ratings of vigor. We also see the same sort of thing with positive mood. And then on measures of depression at the bottom there, of course, these are the low depression people are not reporting very much in the way of depressed mood, and the depressed people are reporting some depressed mood. It's decreasing, but it decreased in this case for after both placebo and drug. So this is kind of another possible direction, is looking at the effects of these drugs. So we could now do this, for example, with repeated doses, or we could do it with a more depressed subject sample. There are lots of remaining questions. All the sessions we've had today end on this note that there are so many things that we don't know, and it's such a it's an area that has so much potential that we're all kind of energized to look farther and see whether there's something there. So you can ask the question, did we test long enough in the repeated dosing study? So maybe you have to take the drug for 3 months in order to see any kind of beneficial effects. Did we test the right people? So maybe we need more depressed people, or need people with some life situation that we didn't get at. And we also don't know whether we had the most sensitive outcome measures. So we don't know exactly what it is that the drug does, so we don't know how to measure it. So we're kind of going blind here with the microdosing. We also can ask further, once we find what are the brain mechanisms that mediate these effects, is there therapeutic potential, for what indication, and then all kinds of questions about individual differences and doses and duration. I just want to end with this quote that kind of gave me pause. It's from a book that was written by Houston Smith, and he's talking about other LSD or psychedelic researchers. And he says, this led Groff to conclude that LSD is not a specific causal agent, but rather a catalyst, an unspecific amplifier of neural and mental processes. It raises to consciousness for the patient material that is otherwise buried, and enlarges this material so that it appears as if under a magnifying glass. So this is raising something that would be a challenge for us, because it suggests that whatever the drug does is unique to the individual. It's turning up the volume of something that's a problem for that person. And that's going to be almost impossible for us to measure. We can't equate those different issues that people are bringing in and the different concerns, and we certainly would have difficulty measuring them. So it's just something else another question that arises with this new category of drugs that's kind of, activated all of us and got us so interested. But there's so much more to be done that I'll be looking forward to what all the trainees in the room come up with in the next couple of decades, and we'll be a lot farther along. So I just want to acknowledge some of my collaborators and colleagues who've contributed. Royce Lee is the psychiatrist who works with me. Katrin Preller did the fMRI analysis. Anya Bershaw did several of the LSD studies. And lots of postdoctoral fellows and research assistants and graduate students have contributed to the work. And we got a little bit of support we got the drugs from MAPS. Beckley Foundation gave us a little bit, and then NIDA gave us a little bit as well. Or they support me anyway. So thank you very much.
How much time was there between each of those 4 sessions?
3 to 4 days. 3 to 4 days.
Any other questions? Dr. Woolley?
Hi, that's amazing. Why did you pick LSD and not psilocybin?
I think only because I had access to it.
Other questions? I have a question. You can't answer this, obviously, but maybe you could speculate. To what degree do you think that the stimulant-like effects that you're seeing with reward processing and the like are related to 5-HT2A mechanisms versus dopaminergic mechanisms?
I have no idea, and I'd be really interested. I've thought about giving the LSD with a dopamine antagonist. Unfortunately, with the dopamine antagonist, there's such a narrow window before you start getting direct effects of the antagonist itself. that it's a very challenging technically to do. And so I am very curious. And you can imagine that this stimulant-like effect, if people are experiencing it in the natural situation, could give them the impression that they're getting some life benefits. They feel more energetic, they feel more confident, they feel more optimistic. And these are all things that we see with amphetamine. So it could be that there is some sort of a dopaminergic component. Like I said, I don't know the receptor mechanisms that well for these low doses, but you're absolutely right that we don't know whether it's serotonergic.
Could you give people ketanserin?
Yes, we probably could. I'm not sure if it's available in the U.S. That's the only thing. It's available in Europe, but not so much here.
Pimavanserin may be a better choice.
I'd be very interested in doing that, right? Yeah.
Dr. De Wit, I do have a question. Thank you for bringing order and sense and data to this conversation. If these are really, I guess I have two questions. I'm still not clear on whether a microdose is a dose that does something or doesn't do something. And following up on that, if we're seeing stimulant-like effects at peri-threshold doses, well, why not just use caffeine? Or something like that. And would that be a good control? Or should people who think they should microdose just drink more caffeine?
Well, caffeine would be one option, but I think amphetamine is something that would be even more similar, and it has antidepressant effects. And it has another set of problems if you become dependent on it. But so that's a practical reason. With regard to defining microdose, there's a group of people, scientists, who've decided that to define something as a microdose, it has to be subdetectable. I'm not sure I agree with that. To my mind, microdose just means very small, so it could be just detectable, and it could be that you only get benefits if you're above that threshold. So that's kind of a point of terminology. So we might.
So it seems like maybe there's some tolerance that people are developing after repeat microdosing with just 3 to 4 days in between. Do you have any knowledge if microdosing can mitigate the effects of macrodosing? In other words, is there a high enough tolerance developed after a few sessions of microdosing that somebody might not get the effects of a macrodose?
That's an interesting question. I would just be guessing. I would say if they've been microdosing on a regular basis, you see a dampened response, but you might be able to overcome it with a higher dose. But I'm just guessing. I don't know. It's a good, interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
It was an amazing talk, and I'm going to preface my question with the fact that I'm a huge fan of your sex differences work on psychostimulants and females being predisposed. So that would allow me to ask, do you think that there could be a sex effect within microdosing?
We see no sex differences in any of these studies that look at acute or repeated doses. So basically, it doesn't seem to be an issue.
Do we know the bioavailability between LSD versus psilocybin, let's say, for these microdoses? Like, for example, in ketamine IV treatment, it's 100% bioavailability, so they use extremely low doses. But in lozenge, there's only 15 to 30% bioavailability. Is there a difference, for example, in LSD and psilocybin?
I don't know the answer to that. The potencies are hugely different, and I'm not sure how they administer psilocybin. The LSD is sublingual, so it's in a liquid. It's sublingual. Bioavailability, I don't know the answer to that. Mark, you might know. No. All right.
Questions for Dr. De Wit? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.